Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. John's Adult Forum today. I'm really excited that we're welcoming here today Kristyn Peck, who's a longtime friend of St. John's and many at St. John's. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Lutheran Social Services of the National Capital Area. It's a mouthful, but basically they're one of the important affiliates of one of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies that have contracts with the US government to resettle refugees through the regular refugee process, and doing many other things too these days. And since she joined LSSNCA in 2020, Kristyn has quadrupled its revenue and tripled its staff. So she's a management genius. Thank you for that, because you're helping so many people. And she also led LSS's response to the largest crisis we've seen in a generation in these parts, which the Afghans who arrived in great numbers. And LSS provided refugee resettlement services to over 4,500 Afghan allies in the DC metro area in fiscal year 2022. So they do a ton of great good work. Kristyn also serves as the vice chair of the Refugee Council of the USA. The Refugee Council of the USA is a coalition of 25 nonprofit organizations that are committed to the work of welcome, protection, and resettlement of refugees. So that, from that perspective too, I'm looking forward to hearing from you about current challenges and opportunities. Before she joined in this work, she has a long career in child welfare type issues, both domestically and internationally, including protection and welcome and resettlement of unaccompanied children who end up in the United States. And that's another special part of your work that we'd like to hear about. So with that, I'm just going to say welcome. Thank you for coming. And thank you for being our great partner over these many years in settling refugees. Kristyn.
Good morning, and thank you so much for welcoming so warmly today. I really enjoyed your service and such a beautiful church. And Nancy shared this with me when I first walked in. Do you all have this? And this is the history of St. John's Norwood's refugee ministry. And I just want to say this history is incredible. The work that we do as a resettlement agency to welcome our new neighbors, we couldn't do it alone. We couldn't do it without congregations like yours. And this is incredible, the amount of social ministry work this congregation does. And then she showed me this. And I thumbed through it and I saw all the ways you help your community. And so I'm grateful and humbled to be in your presence. And I want to thank you for the great work you do. And I also know from this that this is a very knowledgeable crowd already. So I'll share with you what I have on my slides here, but I certainly want this to be interactive and make sure there's time for questions and discussion. And before I start, I think it really helps when you're working with an organization to trust the leadership. And so I wanted to start by briefly telling you a little bit about me and why this is my calling. I have a master's degree in social work. And 20 years ago, my first job after getting my master's degree was actually at Global Refuge, formerly Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And I'm going to move this down a little bit because I'm pretty petite. There we go. I feel like it's in my face. There we go. And my role there, my first job after getting my master's in social work was to serve as an advocate for unaccompanied children who arrived to the US alone without a caregiver, and who had fled violence, persecution, and were coming to seek safety. And they were placed in the custody of the federal government. And my role was to advocate to the federal government on their best interest. And my first case was a child who was from the Ivory Coast. And she shared with me that she was coming to reunify with her uncle. And so part of my job was to do a family tracing and make sure her uncle was who he said he was, and verify that relationship and assess his home and make sure it was suitable. And to also interview her. And through my psychosocial assessment with her and my family tracing of him, I learned very quickly this was not her uncle. And he instead was someone who, through the context of a romantic relationship, his intention was to lure her into sex trafficking once she was released. This was 2005, and in 2005, the way our laws were written were that if the trafficking had not happened, if it was intercepted, that that this young child who had nobody here would be deported. And she wouldn't be deported back to Ivory Coast where she had family. She would be deported to her last point of entry before the US, which was Paris, where she knew nobody. And that case has stuck with me. Obviously, I think about her often. It really upset me because I recommended she not be released to this person, thinking I was doing a good thing, which I was, and didn't know the consequences that would mean she would be sent to Paris where she knew nobody. And I'm sharing that because I was a baby social worker. I was 25 years old, but that was so upsetting to me that my lesson from that was, if I'm going to be a social worker, I'm going to be the kind of social worker that works to change flawed systems. The system is flawed. It failed this child. And so 3 years later, when the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was reauthorized, it's a mouthful, TVPRA of 2008. I was then working at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in their Migration and Refugee Services unit, doing children's services work. And I spoke all the time to their policy and advocacy department. This law needs to be changed. This is the case that shows how broken the system is. And we were able to get a provision in that law that allowed the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which cares for unaccompanied children, to determine a child eligible for the same benefits of a refugee in the case that no one was here to take care of them, and that case were to happen again. And so I'm sharing that because sometimes the challenges that the people we're serving seem so insurmountable. And that situation inspired me to continue to advocate for systems change. As a social worker, I believe all of our systems are flawed. And the best way to change them is to work within them and understand them. So that's a little bit about me. Lutheran Social Services, the national, oops, this worked when I practiced it, I promise. I just had to turn it on. Um, I have been serving at Lutheran Social Services, the national capital area, for 4 years. I was really drawn to the mission of the organization, which combines things I'm very passionate about, which is unaccompanied children and people who've been forced to flee their homes, which LSSNCA has been welcoming for more than 100 years. Our vision is an inclusive community of well-being where people thrive. And we know that the work we do works best when it's in and with community. So core to our model is working with community. Last fiscal year, actually, this is fiscal year 23. We just wrapped up fiscal year 24. But in fiscal year 23, we served 3,000 people from more than 46 countries. We enrolled 60 refugee women in our Tea Club, which is a special program that helps refugee women, particularly Afghan women, really bridge that gap. We found that often Afghan women were not working in the professional workforce in Afghanistan, and so they have more barriers to thriving than male counterparts. So the Tea Club is really focused on connecting them with other women in the community. So there's a safe space, and they practice English, they learn how to drive, and they get help with life skills. We served 29 unaccompanied refugee children, placed them in foster families in Maryland and DC. We provide mental health services to 562 asylum seekers, and then placed almost 1,900 people in employment through our job programs. Is there a trick to this that I'm not gonna... Next slide. Yeah, there's one right before that, if you don't mind. Yeah, and this slide has animations, so you have to click twice to get, yeah, there you go. This is just a highlight of the programs that we provide. Of course, you're most knowledgeable about our refugee and resettlement integration programs. I'll share about those a little later. We also provide workforce development. We have funding. We're one of 6 organizations in the US that received funds to provide the case management pilot program. This is a alternative to detention for case management for asylum seekers. And we provide case management, legal services, and mental health to 685 asylum seekers a year through that program. And then we work with a consortium of 10 organizations. It includes the DC Office of Migrant Services that is working at Union Station to receive buses of migrants. And then we provide we have other partners too, which provide food. And we also have, although we do in-house legal services, we make referrals for more complicated cases. We have a youth development and wellness program that provides an evidence-based curriculum for young people in the DC school system, helps them prepare for adulthood. We do break the seal services. We reunify parents and children who've been adopted by other families. And then our citizenship and immigration services. We have a 12-person team that includes immigration attorneys and paralegals that provide legal services. Next slide. And we do this in 9 offices. So in Maryland, you're probably most familiar with our Greenbelt office. We are also in Arbutus and Frederick in Maryland. We have our DC office, and then in Virginia, we have 3 Fairfax offices. It's because 2 are child placing licenses that doesn't let us mix other clients. So we have an office in Fairfax that provides foster care long-term for unaccompanied children, and then one provides short-term foster care for kids that do have family here and need a temporary safe space to stay while they're reunifying. And then in Fairfax, we also have an adult resettlement office. In Alexandria, we have a resource center. We provide a dignified shopping experience for new neighbors. We collect clothing, household items, and our clients can come and shop for free. And then we have classes. We have ESL in-house. We have legal classes, financial literacy. And so that resource center is really a one-stop shop. And then in Woodbridge is another resettlement office. Although we have Lutheran in our name, we are really ecumenical in our work. We work with every faith tradition. I think what's so wonderful about the work we do is the call to welcome transcends religions. And we work really closely with, of course, Lutheran congregations. We are formed by 7 Lutheran congregations. That's our history. But we work with many Christian congregations, such as St. John's, Norwood. We also work with the Muslim community, the Jewish community. More than half of my team is Muslim. We really prioritize hiring people with lived experience in our programs. So many of my team right now are recently arrived Afghan refugees. Next slide. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the work we do through the formal resettlement program, which you've interacted with us most. So once in the US, refugees or folks with humanitarian parole or SIV status, when they come through the State Department's reception and placement program, they are eligible for 90 days of services from a resettlement agency. And those services include case management, school enrollment, ESL enrollment, and applying for public benefits. And then after those 90 days, through other state-funded programs and other grant programs, we're able to serve folks for up to 5 years. The assistance looks quite different after those first 3 months. The financial benefit significantly decreases. And the services are really geared towards employment. That's what the funders prioritize in self-sufficiency. And that's why the work we do so much with community to help make sure that our new neighbors have a village that wraps around them. Here are ways to get involved. These are QR codes that take you to different pages on our website where you can sign up to volunteer, to donate, to welcome families as this congregation has done in the past. Next slide. And this is something I think many of you may be familiar with because St. John's Norwood has been a GNP partner, but GNP stands for Good Neighbor Partner or Champion. And we have different levels of GNP partners depending on the resources your team has, the commitment you want to make. And that can include anything from an initial setup of a home for a newly arriving family to paying rent, committing to paying rent, to helping a family for up to a year with things like helping take the family to driver's appointments, helping help figure out childcare, interview practice, resume writing, setting up a LinkedIn profile. And so we really believe in creating welcoming communities through this work, and that's what we do through this program. We're making sure our new neighbors have a long-term connection in their community when our case management services are no longer able to support them. And we're also introducing our community to our new neighbors. And so these are ways that you can volunteer as an individual or a small group. We've seen one of our Good Neighbor Partner and Champions is Capitol Hill Good Neighbors, and they've now set up, it's over 125 houses. And Capitol Hill Good Neighbors partners with it's Reformation Lutheran Church, there's a Catholic church, there's a Jewish congregation, so it's really a multi-faith coalition. And the way they self-organize is one congregation does mattresses only, and one does employment, and so they really organize themselves so that they can yield that huge work of 125 placements. I shared a little bit about our resource center. When we began responding to the Afghan refugee crisis in the summer of 2021, that was after 4 years of the previous presidential administration, which you may remember, significantly changed policies that impacted arrivals. So prior to the Trump administration, LSSNCA in the last year of the Obama administration welcomed 1,600 refugees a year. And then during the Trump administration, we welcomed 500 a year. And the reason we were able to welcome 500 is because Afghans who had assisted U.S. missions and who therefore received a special immigrant visa, an SIV, were still able to arrive. And so 98% of our caseload during that time were Afghan SIV holders. And if it weren't for that, I don't know if we'd still be around today. So we went from serving 500 people a year during that administration. And then, 9 months into the Biden administration, as you remember, Kabul was seized by the Taliban, and we went from serving 500 a year to 500 a month overnight. And during that time, the community was so generous, we began receiving truckloads, Amazon truckloads by the hour, just full of in-kind donations. And we were giving them away as quickly as we were getting them because we had that many people arriving at our doors who needed these things, who were arriving with nothing but the clothes they had on their backs. But it got to the point where we had no space. We needed everything, but we were using churches and gymnasiums at schools to store the overflow, and then having staff run and grab inventory when we ran out of things. And so we had to say no. And I don't like saying no when people are being generous. So we decided to open a resource center. And so that's where this was birthed. It opened in January 2023. It's in Alexandria. It's a great way to volunteer with us, to get a group together. Our director of that resource center will put you to work. You'll probably be receiving the in-kind donations, organizing, inventorying, putting them on the shelves. You may be helping families with their shopping experiences. And then here's our greatest needs right here. We do collect baby items, and those those fly off the shelves really quickly. Formula, diapers, if you can, car seats, kitchenware, linens, school supplies, books, toys, new and gently used clothing, and more. Next slide. I also have spoken a lot about foster parenting. So again, we have two programs. We have a program in DC that allows placements in Maryland. And that program is the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, and that allows for long-term foster care for youth who either have a status as a refugee or another humanitarian status that qualifies them for the same benefits as a refugee. And these are young people who all family reunification options have been determined not to be fruitful. And so they really need long-term support in a foster home. We also have a short-term foster care program called Transitional Foster Care. We have one in Fairfax and we have one in Baltimore. But we are allowed to place, for the one in Baltimore, other locations in Maryland. And that transitional foster care program is short-term. These are for young people who have just crossed the border. We're assessing family reunification options, and transitional foster care is a more child-friendly alternative to being in one of those large-scale shelters that you often see on the news. So many ways to support LSS. You can host a foster parent or GNP champions recruitment event. I will go anywhere. If you wanted to host like a Tupperware party style party in your home, where you invite your friends, provide some snacks, I'd be happy to come and talk about the work we do. Purchase an item for our Amazon wish list for foster care or for the resource center. We have a newsletter. If you sign up for a newsletter, we keep you posted on the events, on the needs, and really just spreading the news about our good work to your circles, your friends, your family. This is the QR code for becoming a foster parent. You can also email fostercare@lssnca.org. So again, I just wanted to thank you for having me here today and for all that you've done to support newcomers in your community. I have additional slides that talk a little bit about what might happen and our messaging pillars if the administration changes. But I thought I'd pause here because I've shared quite a bit and just wanted to open it up for questions that you may have.
Would ask that you go to the microphone so that people online if you have questions.
So if everyone could come over here, would be great. And maybe could I start just by asking, with the fostering, both short and long term, how does it work with languages and whether you speak, the language of the child that's coming? Is there a preference for that, and how do you handle that?
That's a great question. So our team does a good job at placement matching, and they try to place children with families that if they don't speak the same language, that's okay. But if they can, that would be great. And if not, we are always looking for families that are willing to learn, willing to help that child connect to their cultural heritage and community. Many of the youth in that program are Spanish speaking. They're also learning English pretty quickly because they're in the public schools. A lot of our foster families rely on Google Translate on their phones. So part of it is, we don't require families to speak the same language as the child. It is helpful when they do. But if they don't, it's actually helpful for the child's acceleration of learning the English language.
And as a follow-up, what's sort of the breakdown of the ages? Like, do they come mostly as elementary school or high school or babies? And do they come as family units, 3 siblings together, that kind of?
Great question. So the children we serve can be under 18 to 0, can be any age. The majority are 12 to 17 because they are traveling alone. And so it's often age 11, 12, where you start seeing children migrate to the US. And sibling groups, it varies. Sometimes we have young people in sibling groups, sometimes we don't.
Questions?
One of the questions that's really been in my mind is in this current political environment where refugees and, aliens of any kind are being pilloried. What are organizations like LSS trying to do to try to educate more broadly on what this brings to us as a nation? It just breaks my heart to watch this discussion, and I'm trying to figure out what else I could do to help in that space.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. Lisa, actually, can you flip the slides? I think I might have some that are somewhat responsive to that, but we do our best to, we post statements on social media. We most recently, related to your question, we did post a statement about the really concerning and harmful language we heard about Haitians. And the statement said something like, there's a lot of misinformation about Haitians right now. This type of language, one, spreading misinformation, we all need to check our facts before we share news. And a lot of what was being shared, as I'm sure many of us know, was not true. And secondly, when we share that kind of misinformation, we're really contributing to this polarizing dialogue, spreading fear and hate to people who have been through so much, and we're just making their transition more difficult. So that was kind of the nature of our statement. And then we did also share several posts about what's happening in Haiti and why people are leaving Haiti, why they're here, and what immigration statuses they're arriving with. Because I think some of the misinformation was also surrounding their legal status. And they did have a legal status. And so we shared some more about that. Oh, yeah, go to how we talk about our work. Ooh, yeah, yeah. So how we talk about it, okay. So we have a few themes. And before I get into this, because I think this is a good conversation to have, I'm also seeing a line with questions. Let me respond to questions, and I'll bounce back to this. Does that work? Okay.
Thank you. Two questions. You don't have to answer both, whichever. The first question is, how beholden are you guys to local laws? I mean, are some counties more amenable than others? We keep during the height of the summer of 21, we heard like certain counties were more open to refugees versus other counties. So how does that play into what you do? And then also, could you explain a little more about the designations like asylum versus refugee? And then you mentioned something like if they're deemed fruitful, what does that mean exactly?
Oh, good questions. Okay. So I did not bring a pen. So you may need to remind me if I missed some of your questions. But the first question is about communities being welcoming. That's really important to us. Before we open up an office, we do a community assessment, and we speak with community leadership. We do town halls in the community. And then we make a decision on whether that we look at the school system and what the schools are able to provide. We look at, is the community close to public transportation? Is there employment? And that's how we make decisions on where to open offices. So during the height of the Afghan refugee crisis, we needed more offices because there were so many people coming to this region. And that's the process through which we opened our Budas office in Baltimore County and our Frederick office. And, I think we're really lucky in the DC metro area. In general, this is a more welcoming area than when I talk to other CEOs of similar organizations in other areas of the country. For some of them, they don't have signage. Their team doesn't wear any branded clothing because in some areas of the country, they're targeted by hate groups. So we've been really lucky in this community to have, for the most part, just really welcoming communities, and that is an important factor. The difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, I mean, I think what's interesting is how many different pathways there are now. So you can arrive as a refugee, an asylum seeker. We're now hearing about humanitarian parole. That wasn't something that was used frequently before the Afghan refugee crisis, special immigrant visa. So I'll touch on all briefly. If you arrive as a refugee, you already have that status. You have been identified by the United Nations Refugee Agency, which is UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as having a well-founded fear of persecution, and that your government's unable to protect you. And that persecution is based on your religion, your political beliefs, your gender, your membership in a particular social class, your sexual identity. Those all can be used to qualify you as a refugee. And if you are a refugee, that means you have fled your country, you've sought safety in a second country, but that country is not able to keep you permanently. And so a refugee camp, or sometimes it's an urban setting. There are a lot of places that don't have formal camps. And so the United Nations then works with the countries that resettle refugees, which, including the US, and then refugees will then go through intensive vetting and screening by multiple federal law enforcement agencies before they're brought to the US as a refugee. When they arrive, they are eligible for benefits and services because they already have a status. That status isn't permanent. They'll still have to apply in 5 years to adjust status and become a citizen, but they do arrive with a legal status. If you're an asylum seeker, likely what that means is there isn't a place for you to seek refugee status. So you're also fleeing persecution and violence because one of those 5 protected categories. But for example, if you are fleeing Central America, there actually isn't a place along the route for you to stay and safely seek that status. So you are allowed to, this is where it gets really tricky. Crossing the border is not legal. It's a civil violation, like getting a traffic ticket. But applying for status as an asylee is a legal process. So you cross the border, which is not legal, but then as long as you make yourself known to the federal government, I'm applying for the status, I'm applying for asylum, then you are known to the government. That's a legal pathway to be here. The challenge is, as many of you probably know, it takes at least 6 months to get an appointment with an immigration attorney. Immigration attorneys are overbooked, under-resourced. The federal immigration courts are under-resourced, so they're not able to process cases quickly. And so you have a huge backlog. And when you're an asylum seeker, you're not eligible for anything. So you're here, you're legally able to seek that status, but you're also not eligible for any services or benefits except for through this pilot program that we have that I shared with you. And so you're much more marginalized in that way. It's quite expensive to seek legal status if you don't have a pro bono attorney, and it can take 5 years or more. If you arrive with a special immigrant visa, you're Afghan or Iraqi, and you assisted US missions. And so therefore, and because you assisted US missions, that's put you at risk in your country. Let's put a target on your back. And so you can arrive with the special immigrant visa status. That status makes you eligible for the same public benefits as a refugee. And the process for seeking citizenship is similar. If you arrive via humanitarian parole, that was newer for us. We hadn't seen that until the Afghan refugee crisis happened. And the US didn't have time to apply for or process all these special immigrant visas. They needed to get people to safety very quickly. So the humanitarian parole was a mechanism to get folks here. They have the same benefits as a refugee for 1 year. And then the US has renewed that year to year. However, the pressure in that first year, we served 4,500 Afghans, and we thought for most of that year, if we don't help them apply for asylum by the time this year's up, they're going to be at risk for deportation. So that flooded the immigration courts even more because we were all applying for these asylum as quickly as possible for Afghans with that status. Other populations have come over with humanitarian parole, like Ukrainians. That's another example. And then you asked one more question. Family reunification. Okay, so if you arrive as an unaccompanied refugee or unaccompanied child, I think this is what I was referring to. So maybe it's not. I hope this was. And if you often kids come and they'll have in their pocket like a piece of paper with a name and a number, and they have no idea. This is someone their parents said, call, your Aunt Jody. She's in Nebraska, and this child has no idea where Nebraska is. Maybe they haven't met Aunt Jody. So when this young person is in our foster care program, we're calling Aunt Jody. We're making sure there's a home visit to Aunt Jody's home. Is Aunt Jody who she says she is? Is her home safe? Can she take care of a child? And then if that's true, then the child will be reunified. If not, then that's how children become eligible for this long-term unaccompanied refugee minor program. They have no viable, that's a better word, family reunification options. Sure.
Pivoting to a quite different question, especially in regards to the children who are between 12 to 17, do you have close connections with mental health services for them, for the ones who are doing the foster process here?
Yeah, that's a great question. My team is really good at that, at connecting foster families with available resources in their communities. The team that we have on staff are all licensed clinical social workers. And so that's their network. And so, yes, they are able to connect families with mental health services and wellness services.
Are you still working with 500 refugees a month, and are Afghans still the predominant percentage of that? And I just wondered, does LSS, your workload sounds enormous. Are you adequately staffed and funded?
Good questions. So we serve about 3,000 people a year now. About 2,000 are refugees and 1,000 are unaccompanied children, asylum seekers, and other populations. Majority are still Afghan, but as you saw, we served people from 46 different countries. So we're also serving Ukrainians, we're still serving Congolese, Rohingya from Burma, Yemenis, and then from Central America, a lot of Central Americans, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, also serving Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians. That's probably the top, however many countries I just named, 10 or so, 15 countries that we're serving folks from. Are we adequately staffed and resourced? I don't think we are. I don't think resettlement agencies are. I think this is a really flawed system and program. One of the challenges I'll share is like the same way I feel about teachers. I think case managers and teachers are just undervalued in our culture. Case management is treated and funded as an entry-level position. However, case managers are working with people at the most vulnerable parts of their lives. And so that's a real challenge because it's a really hard job. It requires someone that has a lot of life experience and skills to be able to help families navigate all these challenges. And yet it's so under-resourced, and we've really tried to raise our salaries each year, but the salaries aren't sustainable for it to be more than a year or two job. And so we have like a high turnover, which is costly, requires us to do a lot of training, a lot of retraining. So that's a really big challenge. I think another big challenge, my vision would be, regardless of your migration pathway, you could walk into any of our offices and receive equity and services. But that's not how the funding works. There's a lot of funding for refugees. There is funding for unaccompanied children, but for people who are seeking asylum, there's a lot less support. And then even for refugees, although comparably there is more funding, we've been advocating for as long as I've been in my career for there to be an adjustment for cost of living in each location. Refugee families that live here receive the same amount as refugee families live in Minnesota. And the dollar goes a lot farther in Minnesota than it does here. And so that's where the work we do in and with community is so important. Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to comment one thing on the process of becoming a permanent resident or citizen. I have been through this myself with a friend. We started in August of 2016 when I realized somebody was going to become president and wasn't sure what was going to happen to my friend. And it has taken until just last month for her to get her permanent. It took us 4 lawyers, tens of thousands of dollars. And there should be, I mean, and she was somebody who, again, could have applied for asylum, but you have to know you can apply for asylum. That's the other thing. So anyway, it is a harrowing, very difficult thing. And as a privileged white woman, I used my privilege, and it still only took 8 years to get her.
Well, congratulations. So she has asylum now?
She has
That's great.
permanent resident card. We're so excited.
Yay.
3 years to citizenship. But I did want to ask, because you're the National Capital area, do you then do you place families for the kids for the foster system in the National Capital area, or do they have to live in DC? In other words, do they also have to go through the foster care, approval process for Montgomery County? And how does that work?
So we are licensed in DC, Maryland, and Virginia.
Okay.
So we can place in all 3 jurisdictions. We are required to, foster parents do have to follow the same requirements as you would if you were a foster parent in your local county. And we help you with that process. And there is some additional training you have to take to care for a foreign-born child, because it looks a little bit different, but there is parity between the domestic system and the unaccompanied refugee minor system.
Hi. First, I'm really happy to hear about your organization and what you do. I didn't know anything about it. I'm a retired teacher, and my information from personal experience is old because I retired in 2008. And I'm hoping things have changed now. I'll ask my question at the end, but where I'm coming from is I taught in Montgomery County for 30 years, mostly middle school. And I love teaching. I wasn't planning to retire in 2008. And typically immigrants in middle schools, they had one class, English for speakers of other languages. And then in the rest of our classes, if they didn't speak English, we were told to just let them sit in the back of the room and absorb. And when I could, because I was trained originally as a reading specialist, I tried to do more than that with students that I had. But I didn't know that there was any other resource like this or any community like you have. And through the years, I saw how this was a quiet, neglected kind of thing in Montgomery County Public Schools. And in the last school in which I taught, it was typical for MS-13, male MS-13 members to sexually abuse undocumented girls all day long, because they could threaten, they did threaten them by saying they will turn their parents in. This was kind of overlooked and not dealt with until one member sexually assaulted a girl in my classroom. I don't speak Spanish. I don't know what the exchange was that led to it. But I was horrified, and when I got the abuser to leave the room, the principal brought him right back in and made him sit next to the girl he abused. She's still a principal there. And I turned in my papers to retire that night. I couldn't stop this. And so I'm hoping all these years later that classroom teachers, if you work with do you educate classroom teachers in the area to tell them there's this resource. This is how you can work with immigrants. These are things you can do, things I didn't know. I was just guessing. Are you involved in the classrooms at the classroom level now? Because I think teachers would just love that.
Thanks for sharing your experience. It's awful. I'm so sorry to hear that. There's a really wonderful organization called Immigrant Connections. Their founder, her name is Laura Gardner, and I've worked with her for years. She's fantastic. And this is her mission, is to get into schools and talk to educators and talk to school systems. She does that all over the US, but she does do that in Montgomery and Prince George's. She'll call us and have us send one of our staff that has lived experience to join her to talk about their experience. I'm really sorry to hear about your experience. It does sound like a huge gap, but if you ever wanted to reach out to her, I'd be happy to pass on her contact information. But this is where, we work in flawed systems, and we all need to be good advocates. I know Deacon Ann is doing a lot of advocacy with Montgomery County to try and get dedication to refugee and immigration issues and attention on resourcing for those. Our staff, we have school liaisons. So if that were a case that we had, you would let one of our school liaisons know, and they would advocate for the children individually. I would say in that case, I would want to make sure the FBI is called to investigate the MS-13 member, because that would be their jurisdiction. But it's really awful. I'm sorry to hear about your experience.
We still have a few minutes. We'd love to hear
Slides. Okay, great. So how do we talk about our work? So these are, I have some pillars that we use at LSS, or themes. So I often find when talking to folks who may not know a lot about this issue or think differently, either talking about religion and how the call to welcome transcends religions. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes I talk about my own family story and just sharing personal stories, either your own, someone you know, and asking them about their story, but really reminding us all that immigration is a fundamental aspect of our history as the United States, and in the world's religions, and welcoming those fleeing violence and should we say persecution, not prosecution, and seeking a better life reflects the core values of our nation. So that's one thing that we use when we're doing messaging. Immigrants are vital to our economy and communities. They contribute to innovation, culture, and workforce diversity. We are working on, which I think we'll have released this week, and I'll share with you. It's an election guide, and it just talks about how to talk about the work we do, what's at stake. And we have a lot of data here in our guide about the incredible economic contributions of refugees and immigrants. I'm happy to share that with you, and you can share with others if that's helpful. Including taxes. And the third theme is the U.S. obligation to strengthen and expand protection spaces for refugees and immigrants. So the reason we went from serving 1,600 refugees a year to 500 a year when the administration changed is because the president is in charge of what's called the presidential determination, which is the annual ceiling for how many refugees can be admitted to the US per year. And for example, President Biden's presidential determination is 125,000. President Trump's was 15,000. And President Obama's was 85,000. This is really challenging because it requires the amount of people the US admits to be, subject to the political whims of who's in the White House. And when that changed, when President Trump was elected, it dismantled the whole international protection system as well as domestic. And it was really just this year that it was finally rebuilt. And if there is a second Trump presidency, we can expect for it to be dismantled again, for that presidential determination to decrease. So when we're advocating, we advocate for a floor for refugee admissions. So it's not subject to this presidential determination. It would be an act of Congress rather than up to the president. And then, of course, comprehensive immigration reform. We can all agree our immigration system is broken. The fact that it took, where's the person who, it took 8 years for someone who was qualified to get that status and tens of thousands of dollars, and she didn't know the pathway, is exemplary of how broken the system is. But in fixing the system, we also need to make sure that we expand protection for those who are those who need it, while also ensuring national security. I think that might be it. So those are just 3 highlights. Or 3 themes. We do have more in our election guide, which I'm happy to share. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? We could take maybe one.
There's one from the chat.
Okay.
So, yeah, if I can remember. Okay, so there's a church, one of our parishioners is associated with a church in Alexandria, Lutheran church, that has a rectory that they're using for refugee housing. It was through Global Refuge. Just curious if you have any familiarity with that organization.
Yeah, well, probably. Is that Peace Lutheran?
I don't have the name of the church.
I bet it's Peace Lutheran. So Peace Lutheran is great. They are one of our partners. They also work with Global Refuge. Global Refuge is a national organization that, as Pastor Ann said, there are 10 national organizations that have contracts with the State Department to receive refugees, and then they share those with their local affiliates. So we're one of their local affiliates. Global Refuge opened an office in Alexandria during the height of the Afghan refugee crisis, because there were so many people coming to the community, and there was just a need for more support. And so I know that they worked with Prince of Peace on that. That's about as much as I know.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Kristyn. We could go on all day on this important subject, and we will, because at 12:30, our refugee ministry is meeting, and we're going to talk more about it if you want to stay. But I just wanted to point out that we've worked with Lutheran Social Services first. That's how we got started here at St. John's with Refugee Ministry, by equipping apartments. We did, I don't know, 4 or 5 apartments, and we heard from the congregation that they wanted to engage with the people that we were housing. So we took the next step, and we had a Congolese family of 10 was our first family. And that was really trial by fire, right? We learned how to host a family. And then after that, we had an Afghan family, the Sistanis, through LSS. And I have to thank you that you then helped me with another family. Your lawyers helped us get a woman and her 3-year-old daughter out of Afghanistan, evacuated to Islamabad and here to the US. And we have another refugee family in the pipeline that we are going to work with you on. So thank you for being such a great partner and for the wonderful work that you do. We're all in. Thanks. Please come in and meet Kristyn.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to know you all today.